surrendered to God, on mission for God, had a deep sense of calling, and at every place, every turn, every moment in his ministry, just an overwhelming determination. And that's what we've been thinking about and looking at as we think about Nehemiah, this need for spiritual stamina, this need to be determined. And so a few weeks ago, Nehemiah chapter 1, determined to care. A couple weeks ago, Nehemiah chapter 2, determined to proceed, determined to get started. And Nehemiah was so centered in God's will and purpose that he knew when God's timing had arrived. So he didn't rush it, he didn't push it, he wasn't on his own calendar, but he was so attuned to God that when the opportunity was created by God to get started, Nehemiah was ready, and he had prepared for just that moment, for just that opportunity. And then last week we looked at all of those people listed in Nehemiah chapter 3, and that just spoke to our hearts and spirits that we each need to be determined to do our part. This was not a Lone Ranger solo act by Nehemiah. It was just an entire group of people that Nehemiah was leading and that he was in partnership with, and each one was doing what they needed to do. Each one was determined to do their part. And so you and I in the body of Christ today need to have that same sense, that same determination to us. So this morning in Nehemiah chapter 4, we're going to give it the heading of determined to conquer opposition. Determined to move through opposition. When Sanballat heard that we were rebuilding the wall, he became angry and was greatly incensed. He ridiculed the Jews, and in the presence of his associates and the army of Samaria, he said, "What are those feeble Jews doing? Will they restore their wall? Will they offer sacrifices? Will they finish in a day?" So he's mocking them. "Can they bring stones back to life from those heaps of rubble, burned as they are?" We skip a couple verses. We have Nehemiah's prayer, "Hear us, our God, for we are despised." Turn their insults back on their own heads. Give them over as plunder in a land of captivity. Do not cover up their guilt or blot out their sins from your sight, for they have thrown insults in the face of the builders. So we rebuilt the wall till all of it reached half its height, but the people worked with all their heart. But there's always a but, isn't it? As soon as everything gets going good. But when Sanballat, here we go, Tobiah, the Arabs, the Ammonites, and the people of Ashdod heard that the repairs to Jerusalem's walls had gone ahead and that the gaps were being closed, they were very angry. They all plotted together to come and fight against Jerusalem and stir up trouble against it. But we prayed to our God and posted a guard day and night to meet this threat. Therefore, I stationed some of the people behind the lowest points of the wall at the exposed places, posting them by families with their swords, spears, and bows. After I looked things over, I stood up and said to the nobles, now this is interesting, remember last week the nobles weren't doing anything. They refused to put their shoulder to the work according to Scripture. They've now gotten on board. They've now gotten on board. And so he said to the nobles, the officials, and the rest of the people, do not be afraid of them. Remember the Lord, who is great and awesome. And fight for your families, your sons and your daughters, your wives and your homes. When our enemies heard that we were aware of their plot and that God had frustrated it, we all returned to the wall, each to our own work. Again, just this amazing determination by Nehemiah that regardless of how much the opposition grows, no matter how many join the ranks of the opponents, you know what? He doesn't stop working. He just keeps going. He has such a sense of purpose. And he is so inspired by God, that just becomes contagious to all those around him, and so this becomes a group determination to see this through. I want to begin by saying a word about what opposition, first of all, is not. Because I think that sometimes as believers, we can confuse as to what is and is not opposition. So I want to do three quick things about what opposition is not. There are going to be 3 C's. You know I like to do things this way. It helps me to keep this in mind when I'm speaking. That's why I like to do it. Number 1, a complication is not in and of itself necessarily opposition. You know, sometimes have you ever been doing something and you feel purposed by God to do it, and there's just something that makes us want to believe that, you know, if it's of God and I'm in God and this is the right thing for me to do, you know what? Every door ought to open, every window ought to open, blessings just ought to roll out, and there should never be a complication. That is not necessarily promised to us. In fact, I would suggest to you that anything that is of significance is not going to necessarily in and of itself be easy. That there will be complications. We should not automatically jump to the conclusion that a complication is in and of itself opposition. Sometimes it's just part of the work. It's just part of the work. A second thing that is not in and of itself would be competition. You know, there are good things that are competitors. There are good things, for example, that compete for our resources, that compete for our time, that compete for our energies. And just because things are in competition with each other doesn't necessarily mean that they are opponents, or that is an opponent for us. And the third thing, and this is really probably the big one of the 3 C's, criticism. You know, just because someone offers to us criticism does not make them an opponent. I've been in pastoral ministry for 32 years. And I would say to you that some of the things that I have grown most from are those folks who, with love and grace, have offered me constructive criticism. And because of their criticism, I have learned to do something different, to do something better, to start doing some things, or to stop doing other things. And so their criticism, again, constructive, offered in love, with grace, when speaking truth, clearly I have seen that was used by God to help me as a pastor, as a believer. And so just because somebody offers criticism, hopefully again with the right spirit, does not make them an opponent. Opposition, succinctly defined, particularly as we're learning about it and seeing it happen here in Nehemiah chapter 4, is people who want you to fail. People who want you to fail. People who want you to fail, more specifically, as a believer. As a Christian. They want you to fail in your prayer life. They want you to fail in your ministry. They want you to fail in your service to the Lord through the church or through other means, but they want you to fail. They're a Sanballat, they're a Tobiah in your life or in my life. They come, they go, they come again, but opposition is people who want you to fail outright. So what I want us to do this morning is just kind of briefly, quickly, just look at some ways that Nehemiah dealt with people who just flat out wanted him to fail. But yet he was determined to not stop working, even against and in face of that kind of opposition. So I want to give you 4 or 5 things from the passage that speak to Nehemiah's determination, and let that kind of speak to our own lives as believers as well. Number 1, Nehemiah encountered opposition that was verbal and harmful. That's kind of where it starts. It's not where it's going to end, but that's where it starts here in Nehemiah chapter 4. Verbal and harmful, but he never stopped working. He never stopped working. And so we have, as chapter 4 opens up, we have Sanballat who's here. He's mocking them, he's ridiculing them, he's being hurtful to them. But what I want to draw your attention to is that as we kind of move through Nehemiah chapter 4, notice that Sanballat has created a new audience for his words. Up to this point, Sanballat, along with his sidekick Tobiah, had basically been speaking these words to Nehemiah and the people. Right? But we notice now in Nehemiah chapter 4, he shifts because they weren't paying any attention to it. Right? He wasn't really thwarting them. So he now has a new audience, and it says, in the presence of his associates and the army of Samaria. I want to kind of nuance that a little bit to make this point. That when things are said that are hurtful, painful, discouraging, insulting, mocking, ridiculing, sometimes it's not the who said it or the what was said that makes it so potent, but the where it was said. The where it was said. In whose hearing this was spoken. I want to give you kind of an example from my own life. Many years ago, I had to go up here to the Granby Road Post Office. And if you've ever been into the Granby Road Post Office, you know it's a fairly small little lobby area there. So anyway, on that particular day, it was really busy. They had 3 clerks at the counter. When I walked in, each clerk was serving somebody. So we've got a clerk and a customer at each station there at the counter, and then there was a line. And the line was all the way to the door. And so I was probably number 6 or 7 in the line when I opened the door and stepped into the lobby. So we got a room. We got a very small room now of about 15, 16 folks. So anyway, I walk in, I'm at the back of the line, and up at the front of the line, waiting to be served, that individual was the next in line to be served by a clerk, was a person that I knew, and so they saw me walk in, and in kind of a very audible voice, said, "Well, hey, Nelson, how are you?" So I said, I'm fine, good to see you, good to see you. Well, it was kind of quiet, heads turned and whatnot. It's fine. Then this individual said in a very audible voice, "Well, I guess you heard what happened at the business meeting at," and then that person named off a local church. You reckon anybody started listening? So wanting to thwart the conversation, I said, I didn't really say anything, just kind of gave a shoulder shrug. And then this individual decided to launch in a very detailed description about a business meeting that had gone south at a local church. It wasn't the who, necessarily. It wasn't the what. If that conversation had happened in the parking lot, I would have not paid that much attention because it wasn't my business. But the where was potent. So now we got 16 people in the Granby Road Post Office that had just heard maybe a half-truth about some church's issue. Let me kind of say this because it's kind of little bit of a segue here. We need to understand that as believers, as Christians, that when we have concerns about church, think about the where that gets said. And so there was the Grandin Road Post Office. So Sanballat and Tobiah, they've talked up and talked at about Nehemiah and the Jewish people, and mocked them and ridiculed them and so on and so forth, but really didn't have an impact. So you know what? They did it, and they're going to get a new audience because they realize, Sanballat realizes that it is the where. It's who's within the hearing can be really potent. So now we've got all of his associates and, according to the text, the army of Samaria. Secondly, Nehemiah's response comes there in that fourth verse. Nehemiah's response is to, you know what, he's just going to get before God, tell God what he needed and why he needs it. And so we have this raw prayer by Nehemiah in the book. And one of the things that immediately says to me is you know what? When we get before God in prayer, just to be real, to be authentic, to be transparent, is the best thing that we can do. Because God knows what's on our heart anyway. And so as Nehemiah just pours out his anger at these opponents and what they were doing and the why of it, man, this just fuels Nehemiah's prayer life. I had somebody say this many years ago, and I think this is true, and I think it's helpful. One of the best ways that you and I can deepen and enrich in our prayer life is if we keep, this person did a prayer journal. And what this individual did was that when he prayed, he would always write down the date, the day, what he prayed for, and why he was requesting that, why he was making that as a request. And he said that over time, what he could do is he could go back. And first of all, he said it was a great way to see how God answered prayer, because he could look back and he said, you know what? I prayed for so-and-so on that particular day, and look what's happening in their life. Might have been a week later, a day later, a year later, but look what's happening in their life. But he could also then go back and see what was going on in his spirit as he prayed that. And so Nehemiah, in the face of opposition, you know what? He doesn't stop working, but he works and he prays all at the same time, because he's determined to keep going. You and I need to do the same. Third, opposition to Nehemiah moved from verbal to active. Moved from verbal to active, but Nehemiah never stopped working. So, Sanballat and Tobiah, right, have hurled insults, they've mocked, they've ridiculed, they've gained a new audience. But wait a minute. Look at what it says there in verse 8. It says they all plotted together to come and fight against Jerusalem. So now the opponents are moving beyond just words to concrete actions. And typically that's the way opposition happens. It starts at one level. If it gets frustrated, it moves to a deeper and more extensive level. And so it's gone from just words, from verbal, to an action plan. But Nehemiah does not stop working. You and I, many of you know that I'm a history guy, and if you know anything about World War II, one of my favorite personalities historically during that period was Winston Churchill. You've got two pictures up on the screen. And I want to kind of explain those to you because I think this just cuts to the heart of just, never giving up. staying the course. Coventry, England, was a city in World War II, about 250,000 people. So, you know, if you took Roanoke County, Roanoke City, Salem, kind of put them together, that's about 300,000. So that gives you some kind of connection population-wise with Coventry, England. And Germany, Nazi Germany, was just running nightly these bombing raids over Coventry, England. They had a lot of industry there that was producing war material, and so they were a prime target. And after doing this for several weeks, on the 14th of November in 1940, Germany unleashed on that day and night 500 tons of bombs on Coventry, England. The devastation was so great that Goebbels, the propaganda minister for the Nazis, turned Coventry into a burg. And for the years that followed of World War II, whenever they would just bomb out a city, Goebbels and the Nazis would say, "We Coventry'd them." The image on the left is Coventry Cathedral. And there you see Winston Churchill touring the damage. About a year later, Churchill was speaking to a boys' school, Harrow School. And he's talking about Coventry. And of course, everybody in England was keenly aware of what had happened in mid-November of 1940 to that city. Keenly aware. And in the midst of that speech, a lot of people think this was the speech in total, but it wasn't. It was a rather lengthy speech, but in the middle of that speech, Churchill looks out upon the boys and the faculty of that school, and of course the media, the British press is there. And he says, talking about Coventry, he says, quote, "This is the lesson. Never give up. Never give up. Never, 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 never. Even though apparently the overwhelming opposition of the enemy comes against you." Well, that phrase, those words, those sentences were picked up, and of course they become one of the most inspiring moments, speech-wise, that Churchill did in World War II. The image that you see on the right is Coventry Cathedral, the remnants today. Coventry Cathedral got rebuilt adjacent to what you're looking at on the screen. But the city of Coventry decided that they weren't going to tear down the old Coventry Cathedral remnants. Why? Well, there was some sentiment that it would serve as kind of a monument, a memorial to those in Coventry that had lost their lives during that terrible month in 1940. But more importantly, they kept it up because Coventry came back. Coventry never surrendered. Coventry never gave up. They lived out those inspiring words of Churchill. And so that remnant stands today as a monument, not necessarily in total to those that were lost, but to the resiliency of facing the opposition. You may have had, as a believer, somewhere in your journey, you may be having a Coventry experience right now as a believer. May Nehemiah chapter 4 speak to you that no matter the fact that the army was arrayed against him, Nehemiah never gave up. Never gave up. Never gave up. Kept the work going. And you know, if you and I were to stop and think about just for a moment where we were in Nehemiah chapter 3 last week, think of the folks that were rebuilding the wall in Jerusalem, right? Goldsmiths, merchants, farmers, priests, here we go, right? Perfume makers. This is not a militia. This is not a well-trained army. But they never gave up. They never gave up. And so when the opposition got deeper, when the opposition got stronger, Nehemiah and the people prayed, Nehemiah and the people got stronger, and when it went from verbal to active, you know what? The battle was the Lord's. The battle was the Lord's. Number 4.